The morning mist usually clings to the towering oak trees of Lake Forest, Illinois, long after the sun has begun to peek over the horizon, casting a silver, almost ghostly veil over the sprawling estates of the Midwest's most influential families. This was a world of quiet power, where the gravel on the driveways was raked to perfection and the scandals were buried deeper than the foundations of the limestone mansions. For Patrick Phillips, a 37-year-old veteran, firefighter, and emergency medical technician, these mornings were usually defined by the smell of stale coffee at the station and the rhythmic checking of oxygen tanks. Patrick was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and the best of it, his face etched with the kind of subtle lines that only come from a decade of running into buildings that everyone else was running out of. He lived a quiet life in a modest bungalow in a working-class neighborhood, far removed from the gold-leafed gates of the wealthy, but his profession frequently took him behind those very gates. He had always felt like an outsider in these neighborhoods, a man of calloused hands in a land of manicured nails. Yet he carried a deep-seated sense of duty that transcended social class. It was on a Tuesday, during a particularly humid July, when the air felt thick enough to swallow, that the first call came from the Vance manor. The Vance estate was more of a fortress than a home, a sprawling French provincial masterpiece owned by Benjamin Adams, a 44-year-old venture capitalist whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and overnight market shifts. The dispatch call was for a non-responsive elderly female, and as the ambulance wound its way up the long, winding driveway lined with ancient elms, Patrick felt a strange tightening in his chest. It was an instinct, a gut feeling honed by years of triage and high-pressure decision-making that told him this wasn't just another routine wellness check for a wealthy socialite who had taken one too many sleeping pills. The air at the estate was to still the silence too heavy. When the heavy oak doors were opened by a silent butler, Patrick and his partner were led into a world of opulence that felt strangely cold, despite the summer heat radiating outside. When they finally entered the master suite on the second floor, the air changed again. It was heavy with the scent of expensive lily, a floral smell so cloying it almost felt like it was trying to hide something in beneath that. Something sharper, something clinical and metallic. There, lying in a bed that looked large enough to host a small family, was 71-year-old Margaret Rodriguez. She had once been the undisputed matriarch of the Chicago social scene, a woman known for her sharp wit, her philanthropic iron fist, and a business mind that had helped build the Vance empire from the ground up after her husband's passing. But the woman in the bed was a mere ghost of that legacy. She looked like a translucent shadow, her skin a pale, waxy yellow that reminded Patrick of old parchment. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, a stark contrast to the vibrant, high-energy oil paintings of her younger self that adorned the walls, depicting a woman who commanded every room she entered. Now, she seemed to be sinking into the mattress, as if the house itself were slowly reclaiming her. Standing by the large bay window was Benjamin Adams. He looked every bit the stressed executive. His expensive suit Patrick had discarded on a chair, his eyes glued to the vibrating phone in his hand, even as his mother lay unconscious. Next to him was his 34-year-old wife, Angela. Angela was a vision of curated, high society perfection. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a seamless, tight knot that looked painful, and her eyes were filled with a performative, watery concern that didn't quite reach her voice. She stepped forward as Patrick approached the bed, explaining in a voice as smooth as silk and just as cold that Margaret had been suffering from a rapid onset of early-stage dementia and a mysterious autoimmune flare-up that the private doctors couldn't quite pin down. Angela spoke with an air of practiced authority, listing medications and symptoms as if she were reading from a script. Patrick, however, was already busy with his assessment. As he checked Margaret's vitals, he noticed something peculiar that sent a spark of suspicion through his mind. The woman's pupils were pinpricks, unresponsive to the light, and there was a slight, rhythmic tremor in her hands, a pill-rolling motion that didn't align with the typical presentation of the illnesses Angela was describing. Over the next 3 weeks, the fire department was called to the Vance estate 4 more times, each call more urgent than the last. Patrick began to notice a pattern that others, perhaps blinded by the family's immense wealth and the authoritative presence of their hand-picked private physicians, seemed to overlook. He saw that Margaret's condition always seemed to deteriorate significantly in the late evenings, specifically after her recovery meals were served by Angela. On the 4th visit, a sudden equipment failure required Patrick's partner to return to the truck, leaving Patrick alone in the room with Margaret for a brief, heavy moment, in a sudden, jarring moment of lucidity. The elderly woman reached out and gripped Patrick's forearm with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone so frail. Her eyes, briefly clearing of the fog, were wide with a primal, terrified light. Before Patrick could ask a single follow-up question, The heavy door creaked open. Angela entered the room with a glass of water and a charming, predatory smile, and the light in Margaret's eyes immediately extinguished, replaced by a dull, glazed look of absolute submission. Patrick couldn't shake the interaction for days. He spent his off-duty hours at the station, not resting or playing cards with the guys. But buried in medical journals and toxicological reports, he knew Benjamin was rarely home, often buried in international mergers that kept him in Tokyo or London, leaving Angela as the sole, absolute caregiver for the fading matriarch. Patrick's gut told him that the millionaire's mother wasn't dying of old age or a hidden disease. She was being systematically, surgically dismantled. He began to pay closer attention to the architecture of the household. He noticed Angela's subtle control over the staff, how she always insisted on being the one to administer Margaret's special herbal supplements, and how she seemed strangely eager to point out Margaret's deteriorating mental state to any visitor, effectively isolating the woman within her own mind. It was a classic case of gaslighting, but it was being performed on a stage made of marble and gold. Patrick knew he had no legal jurisdiction to investigate, and his captain would likely write him up for overstepping his bounds. But he also knew he couldn't just stand by and watch a slow-motion murder. He decided to use his status as a concerned first responder to bridge the gap. He approached Benjamin during a rare moment when the man was on the front lawn offering to conduct a comprehensive home safety and fire risk assessment for the service. The department technically offered 2 seniors to prevent falls and electrical fires. Angela, who appeared on the porch just as the agreement was made, didn't hide the flash of irritation that crossed her face, though she quickly masked it with a polite nod. As Patrick walked through the mansion under the guise of checking smoke detectors and battery backups, he felt like a spy in a foreign land. He saw the way the household staffed the maids. The gardeners avoided Angela's gaze, as if they were afraid that looking at her too long would invite a wrath. The house felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. In the kitchen, a cavernous room of stainless steel and white quartz, he met Betty Wilson, a cook who had been with the Vance family for over 20 years. She was a woman of few words, her face a map of decades of service, but when Patrick mentioned how much he admired Margaret's past work with the City S, Library's Betty Wilson's eyes welled with sudden hot tears. She didn't speak, but her hands trembled as she wiped down the counter. This was the final piece of the puzzle for Patrick. He realized that the danger wasn't coming from a lack of care, but from the care itself. He saw the hidden dynamics of the house, the power Angela wielded, the isolation of the grieving son, and the terrifying vulnerability of the mother who had once owned it all. Patrick knew he was stepping onto a landmine, but as he sat in his truck that evening, looking at the photo of his own mother on his lock screen, he knew he couldn't walk away. The conflict was no longer just about a medical emergency. It was a battle for a woman's soul against a predator in a designer dress. Patrick's investigation began to consume his every waking moment, blurring the lines between his professional duties as a first responder and a deeply personal crusade for justice that he could unquite explain to his colleagues. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's terrified expression and felt the ghostly grip of her hand on his arm, a silent plea for a rescue that no fire engine could provide. He knew that to save her, he needed more than just a seasoned firefighter's intuition. He needed undeniable, cold hard evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of a high-priced legal team and, more importantly, pierce the thick veil of Benjamin Adams's stubborn denial. Patrick began to orchestrate reasons to visit the manor under the pretext of follow-up wellness checks and equipment calibration for the Home S emergency oxygen supplies. He often brought small, thoughtful gifts for Margaret, a book of vintage Chicago photography or a soft cashmere lap blanket tendency to keep a line of communication open and to show her that someone was watching. During these visits, he observed Angela with the clinical, detached precision of a hawk. He noticed that she kept a small, vintage-style vanity case tucked away in the back of the walk-in pantry, hidden behind rows of expensive artisanal oils and imported spices that no one ever touched. It was a misplaced object in a room of utility, and it called to Patrick like a siren. One afternoon, the opportunity he had been waiting for finally presented itself when Angela was momentarily occupied in the sunroom, loudly discussing the logistical details of a $500 play charity gala over the phone. Patrick, moving with the silent efficiency he had learned while navigating smoke-filled hallways, slipped into the pantry. He found the vanity case. It was unlocked, perhaps a sign of Angela's growing overconfidence. Inside, he found no cosmetics or jewelry. Instead, there was a series of small, unlabeled glass vials and a precision dropper. The liquid inside was clear and looked as harmless as spring water. But Patrick's training in hazardous materials reminded him that the most lethal substances on Earth are often those that leave the fewest traces. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he was looking at a murder weapon in progress. He quickly snapped a series of high-resolution photos of the vials in the case before retreating back into the hallway just as he heard Angela's high heels clicking against the marble floor. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind he usually felt right before a roof collapse, but he had to keep his face a mask of professional boredom. The emotional depths of the situation hit Patrick with the force of a physical blow during a quiet, humid moment in the garden with Margaret later that week. She was seated in her motorized wheelchair, staring blankly at the prize-winning roses she used to prune with such meticulous joy. But her hands were now too shaky to even hold a pair of shears. Patrick sat on the stone bench beside her and spoke softly about his life at the firehouse, sharing stories of the station dog and the bad cooking of the rookies, trying desperately to anchor her to a reality that Angela was slowly stripping away. Suddenly, Margaret turned her head, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and clarity. She told him that she knew Angela wanted her gone, that she had accidentally overheard a hushed, late-night conversation between Angela and an unknown man about liquidating the estate and the necessary timeline once the probate period was finalized. The betrayal was staggering. Margaret had welcomed Angela into her family with open arms, treating her like the daughter she never had, only to have her kindness returned with a slow-acting, invisible poison. Patrick felt a surge of protective rage, but he knew he had to remain a calm anchor. He told Margaret to trust him, and as much as she could to avoid consuming anything Angela prepared when he wasn't there to watch, though they both knew that was a heartbreakingly impossible ask for a woman so physically weakened by the very substance she was being told was medicine. The true turning point came on a Friday evening after a grueling 24-hour shift. Patrick had arranged for a specialized lab, run by a former Army medic colleague who now worked in high-level forensic toxicology, to test a sample of the liquid if Patrick could somehow secure it. Luck favored the brave when Angela left the estate for an essential spa weekend in Lake Geneva, leaving Margaret in the care of a temporary agency nurse who was more interested in her phone than her patient. Patrick managed to secure a small sample of the special recovery tea that Angela had pre-prepared and labeled in the refrigerator. He rushed it to his contact, and 24 hours later, the results came back like a death sentence. The tea was laced with thallium ***, a heavy metal once used as a potent rat poison, often called the poisoner's poison because it mimics the symptoms of natural degenerative illness and is notoriously difficult to detect without a specific targeted screen. The doses were calculated with terrifying precision, small enough to avoid an immediate, suspicious cardiac event, but large enough to ensure a steady, agonizing decline of the nervous system. Patrick felt a physical chill run down his spine as he realized Angela was unjust a social climber. She was a cold-blooded technician of death who was clearly enjoying the process of watching her mother-in-law wither away into nothingness. Patrick knew he couldn't go to Benjamin just yet. The man was so deeply under Angela's psychological spell, so conditioned to see her as his rock that he might inadvertently tip her off out of sheer shock, allowing her to destroy the vials in the tea before the police could arrive. Instead, Patrick decided to record the undeniable truth. He used his own modest savings to purchase a high-end discreet camera disguised as a common digital alarm clock, which he strategically placed on a high shelf in the kitchen during a preventative maintenance check of the mansion's complex electrical wiring. For 3 long days, Patrick watched the live feed on his phone while sitting in the fire station's lounge, his jaw clenched in silent fury. He watched as Angela returned from her weekend, her demeanor shifting instantly from a charming, laughing socialite in public to a cold, methodical predator the moment the doors were closed. He watched as she carefully measured the thallium into Margaret's evening broth, her face devoid of any emotion other than a chilling, focused intent. The emotional weight of seeing that evidence was nearly too much for Patrick to bear alone. He saw the betrayal not just of a family, but of the very concept of human care and the sanctity of the home. He realized that Angela had been planning this perhaps since the day she said "I do," viewing Margaret not as a human being or a mother, but as a massive financial hurdle that needed to be cleared. Patrick also saw the profound, heartbreaking loneliness of Margaret, who was surrounded by millions of dollars of luxury, but was essentially dying of neglect and active malice in a room full of gold. He spent a long night at the firehouse staring at the digital clock on his phone, knowing that his next move would shatter a man's heart to save a woman's life. Patrick felt the heavy burden of his self-imposed responsibility. He was a firefighter, used to fighting flames he could see and heat he could feel. But now he was fighting a darkness that was invisible to everyone but him. He began to prepare himself for the final confrontation, knowing that the millionaire's mother was running out of time, and that he was the only thing standing between her and a shallow, forgotten grave. The confrontation took place on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 1 month after Patrick's first call to the Vance estate, a day when the sky over Lake Forest was the color of lead, and the wind whipped the rain into frantic patterns against the mansioness windows. Patrick had requested a private, urgent meeting with Benjamin in his home office, a room that felt like a sanctuary of old-world power, filled with the scent of expensive leather-bound books and the faint, lingering aroma of aged mahogany. Benjamin looked utterly defeated, his eyes bloodshot from a chronic lack of sleep and the crushing weight of watching his mother fade away, despite every resource at his disposal. When Patrick entered, Benjamin barely looked up, assuming it was another medical update or perhaps the one he dreaded most, the final notification. Instead, Patrick sat down across from him, moved the heavy crystal paperweights aside, and placed his laptop on the desk alongside a small, sealed plastic bag containing the thallium vial he had retrieved. Without a single word, he pressed play on the video feed. Benjamin watched in a stunned, paralyzed silence as the woman he had built his life around, the woman he had defended against his mother's irrational early suspicions, was shown on a grainy screen systematically and coldly poisoning the woman who gave him life. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic lash of the rain and the chilling digital voice of Angela on the recording mocking Margaret S.'s weakness in a way that made the blood in Benjamin S.'s veins turn to ice. Benjamin's reaction was not the explosive rage Patrick had prepared for, but rather a profound, soul-crushing collapse of his entire reality. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a silent, agonizing grief as the realization of his own catastrophic blindness hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had been so obsessed with his financial empire and international mergers that he had invited a predator into the most sacred part of his home. Patrick stayed with him through the silence, offering the steady, calm presence of a man used to holding the line during the worst moments of people's lives. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he told Benjamin with a firm, professional clarity that they needed to act immediately, not just for the sake of justice, but to physically save Margaret before the damage became permanent. Within the hour, Patrick had used his professional network to coordinate with his contacts in the Lake Forest Police Department and a specialized medical team from the University Hospital. They didn't just walk into the house. They arrived with the full, undeniable weight of the law and medical science behind them, shattering the quiet facade of the estate forever. Angela was in the middle of caring for Margaret in the master suite, her hand on a fresh bowl of broth when the doors were forced open. The look on her face when she saw Patrick standing next to the police was not one of fear, but of a sudden, sharp, and terrifyingly cold realization that her long game had finally reached its end. The arrest was swift and clinical, a stark contrast to the slow violence Angela had inflicted. She tried to maintain her practiced composure even as the handcuffs clicked shut, claiming it was all a tragic misunderstanding of holistic treatments and traditional family remedies. But the lab results and the crystal-clear video footage were insurmountable walls of truth. As she was led out of the mansion and into the rain, she didn't look at Benjamin with a single shred of regret. She looked at him with a piercing, hollow hatred, finally discarding the mask of the loving wife once it no longer served her. Benjamin didn't say a word as she was taken away. He didn't even watch the patrol car leave the driveway. He went straight to his mother's room, where the medical team was already preparing to transport her for an emergency high-intensity detoxification and dialysis treatment. The recovery was a long, grueling journey of small victories and frequent setbacks. Thallium poisoning leaves deep, jagged scars on the nervous system. But Margaret was a woman forged in a different era, and she was a fighter. With the poison no longer clouding her synapses and the paralyzing fear no longer gripping her heart, she began the slow process of reclaiming her life. Patrick visited her every single day at the hospital, and for the first time, he saw the spark return to her eyes. The sharp, formidable woman from the oil paintings was finally, miraculously, coming back to the surface. The resolution of this dark chapter brought about a total transformation, not just for Margaret, but for the entire Vance family and the community they influenced. Benjamin, humbled and fundamentally changed by the experience, stepped back from his high-stakes venture capital firm to focus entirely on his mother's rehabilitation and his own emotional recovery. He realized that wealth was nothing more than a hollow, fragile shield if it couldn't protect the people who truly mattered. In a gesture of immense life-changing gratitude, Benjamin didn't just offer Patrick a financial reward. He partnered with him to found and fund the Thompson Vance Initiative, a pioneering nonprofit organization dedicated to training first responders and home health aides on how to recognize the subtle, often invisible signs of elder abuse and domestic poisoning. Patrick remained a firefighter at his local station, still smelling of smoke and stale coffee. But his role expanded into that of a mentor and a global advocate, ensuring that no other mother would ever have to suffer in a golden cage while the world looked the other way. The Vance mansion, once a place of cold shadows and hidden malice, was filled with light and laughter once again, becoming a sanctuary for Margaret and a lasting symbol of a life reclaimed through the courage of one man who refused to stop watching. We are so incredibly grateful that you stayed with us to the end of this journey of justice and redemption. If this story moved you or reminded you of the quiet power of looking out for one another, we would be honored to have you as a permanent part of our community. Please consider asterisk subscribing and joining our family asterisk here on the channel. We strive to create a warm, welcoming space where the truth is celebrated and heroes are recognized. It truly warms our hearts to see how our global community is growing. Did you enjoy this video? And more importantly, what is the one lesson you'll take away from Patrick and Margaret's story today? Your thoughts and reflections mean the world to us and help us continue to tell the stories that matter. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and keep an eye out for those who might need your help.